Opening credits. Saved by the Vampire. A vampire paranormal romance short story. By Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Chapter 1. I couldn't stop the cynical look that crossed my face as I watched my client, Cooper Harris, look up at his stunningly beautiful wife and smile. They were the quintessential perfect couple, unless you looked beyond the surface. His smile looked strained, clearly forced, and she returned his smile with an equally false yet radiant one of her own. Cooper was seated at a small round private table in the front of the large elegant hall, where all 200 of their guests pottered about. Up until then, his wife Hillary had been seated with him. Mrs. Harris now stood up and
censored
Cooper on top of his balding head. To onlookers the gesture might have seemed sweet. However, I knew her attention to that spot must have made Cooper furious, as it was a deliberate snub given that she berated him almost on a daily basis for losing his hair, as if male pattern baldness was something he could have prevented. As she walked away in a backless evening gown that left little to the imagination, numerous eyes followed her as expected and warranted. I wondered where she was going, and frankly, from the way she had been surreptitiously guzzling back champagne all night, I was just surprised that she could even stand. The Harrises were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary with a vow renewal ceremony, and had spent most of the night making speeches in honor of each other while holding hands in a seemingly loving manner. It would have been a moving ceremony for anyone who didn't know the actual gritty details of their marriage. Lucky me, I thought sarcastically to myself. I knew the couple, well, at least Hillary Harris, far too well. I had to stop myself from rolling my eyes every time they
censored
or made googly eyes at each other. I knew it wasn't real. After all, Cooper had hired me to follow his wife, who he suspected of cheating, and he went as far as to invite me to this shindig. I had been invited solely to catch her in the act. I still couldn't believe it. When Cooper first mentioned it, I looked at him incredulously. Don't you think it'll be a little awkward for me to show up at your ceremony? I am the person stalking your wife, you know? I said earlier that week, when he appeared at my office and started filling me in on his plan. He walked in unceremoniously and requested my presence at said event. His request surprised me, to say the least. He had caught me in the middle of cleaning out the office since I was bored and short of clients. I hated being idle. I had placed a hand on my narrow hips and looked at him closely. My brown eyes were skeptical of the soundness of his plan as I surveyed him. I don't trust her. I don't trust her at all. I wouldn't be surprised if her lover shows up at the ceremony. I just need you to get some pictures so I can divorce her and be done with it. I wanted to argue with him and tell him that he was being ridiculous. In my line of work, I had done some crazy things, but this was a first. However, he was a paying client, the only one I had at the time, and he was paying me well, so I shrugged my shoulders and mumbled, "You're the boss." I didn't need to bother replying, since he was already gone before the words were fully out of my mouth. Apparently, he had issued an order, not a request. No wonder she cheats, I thought to myself. Cooper's a bit of a tyrant. On the night of the celebration, I shoved my lanky figure into a little black dress and slapped on lipstick and eyeliner. I gave my reflection a cursory glance and left, tucking strands of my strawberry blonde hair behind my ears. It was straight, fine, and never seemed to do what I asked, so I kept it cut into a bob that was easy for my line of work. I was a private investigator, and most of my clients were disgruntled spouses. Not much of a romantic, it was the perfect job for me. I felt cheaters deserved to be caught, and when I presented the evidence and the client began to bawl, I was always ready with a box of Kleenex while I handed them a bill for the rest of my expenses. Sighing to myself, I drove to Cooper's vow renewal ceremony, thinking what an incredibly bad idea this was for at least the 100th time, but I needed the money and Cooper paid me up front. I couldn't disappoint him. Most of my business referrals were word of mouth, and given the high percentages of divorces in my county, I figured Cooper would have a friend or two in the not-too-distant future who would need my help. I dropped my car off with the valet and walked purposefully up the marble steps of the hotel where the event was being held. After stopping to speak with the receptionist, I directed to the location of the ceremony. I didn't know how much help I was going to be, following his wife around in front of a crowd of hundreds of guests, but I did my best, making idle chit-chat with the person attending the bar, and then a couple of the waitresses and busboys. They just looked at me, bewildered for the most part. So does bartending rack in great tips, as everyone says, or is it barely enough to make rent? Because I have one of those jobs, not bartending, the barely enough to make rent type of job. I laughed at my own pitiful excuse for a joke. The bartender looked up at me startled. I realized then that he hadn't even noticed that I had been standing there. Wow, was I that forgettable? I guess in my line of work that was a good thing, but geez, I might have been pale, but I wasn't a ghost. I narrowed my eyes at him and then made myself relax. I couldn't force him to talk to me, and I figured I was frightening the poor guy by loitering at the bar and not ordering anything anyway. He finally shrugged in reply. Apparently, he wasn't expected to actually speak with the guests. I stared at him, waiting for him to say something more, but when he just grunted and started cleaning the counters, I supposed I'd just go to the bathroom and hang out there instead. I wasn't exactly an introvert, but I didn't feel like making chit-chat with any of the guests, who most likely would eventually ask how I knew Cooper or Hillary. I wasn't the type who told lies just for the fun of it, too risky in my opinion. I preferred anonymity whenever I worked a case, and frankly, it was too mentally tasking for me to keep up with lies that I would have to tell random strangers. After a while, it just all muddles in my head, so I normally kept to myself whenever I had to get in character for a client. I noticed that Hillary was still missing, and I wanted to see on my way to the bathroom if maybe she was in the hall somewhere, maybe making a call to her lover or something equally salacious. I hooked a left to the bathroom when I didn't see Hillary, and briefly wondered where she could have gone. I then shrugged to myself, remembering that I hadn't been expecting my appearance here to actually make a big difference in my case anyway, so I figured how much trouble could the missus get into if I was only gone for a few minutes. I walked into the fancy restroom. The countertops were marble and looked like stone I would expect to see in an old-world mansion. I could hear classical music playing in the background. The restroom smelled like candy and roses, and there were plenty of little mints for me to help myself. Being a little cheap, and given that they were all individually wrapped, I dumped some in my purse, looking around to see if I would get caught. I thought I was the only one in the restroom, but better safe than sorry, I said to myself, feeling like a greedy kid in the candy store. Just when I was about to freshen up the lipstick I had chewed off, I heard a noise. I instantly joked around to see where it had come from. It sounded as if someone was breathing heavily. Then I heard multiple oohs and ahs, moans and groans. They were loud enough for me to pinpoint the location to a stall, not too far behind me. I knew the hotel where the party was being held was not a trashy establishment by any stretch of the imagination, but I immediately understood that someone was getting it on, using the bathroom as their own personal hookup room. Not wanting to disturb them, I was about to give them their privacy when I saw a shoe hit the ground and roll from under the stall. It wasn't just any shoe. It was vintage Ferragamo, exactly what Hillary had been wearing. The chances that someone else would be wearing the same shoe were slim, I reasoned. Apparently, Hillary had also taken a bathroom break, but she had brought company. Which meant Cooper had been right. His wife was daring enough to meet up with her lover in public and during their vow renewal ceremony, no less. The woman had no scruples. I felt bad for Cooper even if he were a little bossy. He didn't deserve to be cheated on, and I instantly felt guilty for my earlier feelings when I called him a tyrant. Hoping that what I considered a good deed would make me feel better, and finally end the weeks of following Hillary around from shop to shop, I immediately sprang into action. I looked around, knowing I would need to be quick before someone else arrived. I had a little selfie stick that people use to extend their reach when taking selfies. I had doctored it so that it could swivel in different directions. It had come in handy on more than one occasion. I adjusted it so it would face away from me. I knew that if I were careful, I could just stand in the stall next to them, raise the selfie stick and get as many pictures as possible. So that's what I did. I walked as quickly and quietly as I could into the other stall, and took photos of the action going on next to me. There was so much moaning and groaning that no one heard a thing. At least that's what I thought as I smugly put my camera away and then heard the words, "Hey? What's that?" I hightailed it out of the stall, just barely disappearing through the bathroom doors as I heard their stall door bang open. I dashed into a supply closet that was to the right of me and held my breath. My heartbeat was racing. That had been a close one. About 5 minutes later, just as my heartbeat was returning to normal, I moved to leave, but someone turned the knob before I could get there. Instantly, I reached for the nearest item I could find, a broom, and picked it up ready to pounce on whoever it was when a house cleaner in full uniform looked in and screamed upon seeing me. "Oh wow, I apparently had way too much to drink," I said, slurring my words, deliberately trying to appear tipsy. "I thought this was the bathroom. Can you point me in the direction of the party, Eleanor?" I said, peering at her name tag. She nodded, still trying to figure out what I was doing in the supply closet. I gave her a cheery smile and walked away, whistling softly to myself. That evening, as soon as I arrived home, I tossed my dress in the corner, sat down on my couch wearing nothing but my undies, and started going through the pictures. I was pretty impressed by how good the selfie stick worked. I had shots of Mrs. Harris at all angles. Many of them I hadn't wanted to see. It seemed that Mrs. Harris was the adventurous sort, and very flexible. I turned my head to the side, studying one picture in particular, trying to see how one could possibly get into such a position in the tight confines of a bathroom stall. Feeling impressed, although I knew I shouldn't have been, I quickly answered my phone distractedly when it rang. "Hello, this is Lexa," I said, not bothering to look at the caller ID. I only had one client now, Cooper Harris, and he always called at the same time every day. Hence, I figured it was just my friend Christopher. When Christopher didn't immediately say anything, I looked at the phone and realized that it was an unknown number. There was breathing on the phone, and I went to hang up when someone began talking. "Hello, Lexa. You shouldn't have gotten involved." "Excuse me?" I said, thinking it was some sort of prank, but then how would they know my name? I looked down at the phone, about to demand to know who was on the other line, when the voice continued, "You have some photos that you shouldn't have. And we want them back." I felt a chill go up my spine. I didn't scare easily, but the voice was ominous. I was instantly afraid, but was determined not to show it. "Who are we?" "It doesn't matter. Just bring the camera and the pictures to 3rd Street Bridge tomorrow at 8 p.m. Wait for us in front of Jackson's Bar and Grill, or we'll break every bone in your body. Is that clear?" "I don't have to do anything you say." I managed to get out, trying to add defiance to my voice. "You don't have to, but you will. By the way, nice undies." Abruptly, whoever was on the other line disconnected. I looked around my home, scared to death to move from my place on the couch, afraid that someone was in my home at that very minute looking at me. I then saw the lights outside, shining in the direction of my window. The phone dropped from my hand and I tried to breathe, but my heart was beating so fast. I jumped up from my sofa, ran to my window, and sucked in a breath. A car was parked in front of my home, and I could see clearly a man stood in front of a car, waving at me with a smile on his face. I slammed the curtains shut, now shaking all over. What had I gotten myself into? I didn't call the police. I didn't know what to do, so I called Christopher, who was not just my best friend but also my mentor, and I spoke to him in broken sentences, still trying to get my heartbeat under control. He insisted on coming straight over, and he also wanted me to contact the police, but having grown up in and out of juvie, I wasn't exactly a fan of the cops. I heard a knock at my door minutes later, and I jumped startled. Then my phone rang and I recognized Christopher's number. "Is that you at the door?" I asked him. "Yeah. No one's out here. Open up." I quickly went to the door, and he looked me up and down as he came in, inspecting me for any outward signs of distress. I had changed into a pair of shorts and a tank top, so at least I wasn't still in my undies. "You sure you're okay? You're shaking." He was right. I couldn't stop shaking. Knowing that that man had been in front of my home, watching me walk around scantily clad, unsettled me. I was visibly upset still. "Go sit down. I'll make a pot of coffee," Christopher said gruffly. He had salt and pepper hair and brows that extended low on his forehead when he was frowning or angry, as he was now. He was a stocky guy with a bit of a gut. He had been a pro wrestler back at one point, but when an injury ended his career, he had been smart, funneling his money into other endeavors, including establishing several charities, such as the foster home where I grew up. "You've definitely gotten yourself into something," he said as he perused the photos after I had a chance to calm down. The heat of the coffee was soothing in my hands. He stopped talking suddenly and intently stared down at one of the photos. His face was tense in concentration. I expected him to make a comment about the crazy position attempted in the picture, but instead he said, "You didn't recognize the guy from this photo, did you?" I looked down and shrugged. He looks familiar, but I assumed I was just imagining things. He should look familiar. That's Tony Palazzo. He was a presidential candidate. He's married to a hothead in corporate America, from what I remember. They were in the news because of how costly and bitter their divorce proceedings are going. Rumor is that an organized crime family partially funded his campaign. Distant cousins of his or something like that. Are you kidding me? I shook my head. Maybe I needed to find a new job, preferably one where taking not-so-innocent photos didn't lead to situations where I had to fear for my life. It's probably Tony Palazzo who wants the photos. He must have seen you and did some snooping to find you. Now he wants the pictures. I bet they would be ammunition for the wife, and he doesn't want them leaked. Like I said, she's one scary character from what I hear. What am I going to do? Christopher said, "Leave it to the cops." I thought about that for a second and then said, "And tell them what?" I was in a bathroom stall, taking pictures of a couple engaging in
censored
activity, and I need the cops' help to do what exactly? I see your point. You should probably still call them. Chris, I said, exasperated. I'm just saying. Well, say something else. He sighed deeply. I'll go with you. It's dangerous, but maybe they just want the pictures back. No harm, no foul. I nodded, but I didn't feel half as sure as Christopher did. Chapter 2. It was a little bit before 8 o'clock. I was admittedly scared and nervous. I hoped that I wasn't sweating, and I tried to keep my expression impassive, although I felt anything but cool and collected. I hadn't chosen my career because I was fearless. In fact, if anything, I had chosen it because it gave me the ability to do something that wouldn't attract anyone's attention to me. Now here I was, a sitting duck with eyes probably everywhere on me, and I couldn't help but get mad at myself. I had messed up royally. I didn't feel all that better safety-wise, even though I knew Christopher wasn't too far away from me. I wish I could say that I felt everything was fine since he was there, but no. I was scared. I'd never been in this type of situation before. I'd never been threatened before. The worst thing that had happened to me was a disgruntled spouse who threw her drink in my face. Moreover, how in the world did they know I was taking pictures in the first place? Someone must have looked up and saw my camera at the last minute. I felt stupid now for taking the risk, but from all the noises that were coming from the stall, I honestly thought I would get away without being noticed. I kicked at a rock and thought bitterly, no good deed goes unpunished. I started to observe the people around me. I watched a woman with a poodle reach down,
censored
her dog, and wondered why people did that. It always grossed me out, but then again I wasn't a big fan of animals. I continued to survey the area around me. At least I wasn't alone. A man wearing an expensive-looking black sport coat was facing the water, looking at the sunset about 20 feet away from me. I was comforted by the fact that there were witnesses around, and I saw Christopher sitting at a bench pretending to be playing on a tablet, so that gave me a little more courage. That courage left me when a voice spoke up from behind me, breaking me out of my reverie and clearly wanting my attention. "Lexa Charles, I presume," said the voice. I turned around slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The man behind me was short and chubby. His nose was slightly crooked, making me think he had been in more than a few fights in his life. "I have the photos," I said, instantly reaching into my pocket. "I'll take those," he said. "And the camera." I sighed and handed it to him. He carefully took them out of my hand and turned away, and as he did, the woman walking the dog blocked his path and said in a dark voice, "Give me the photos, Marcos." I stood there in between them. Marcos looked at me, and then back at the woman. "Mrs. Palazzo. What a nice surprise. Funny running into you here," he said with false charm. She gave him a mean look and then said evenly, "Just stop while you're ahead, Marcos. Give me the photos." It was then that I could smell the stench of alcohol permeating through her pores and floating through the air. "This is business, Mrs. Palazzo," Marcos said with steel in his voice, no longer trying to appease her. "My husband cheating on me is my business. No one said anything about cheating." "I'm not stupid, Marcos," she growled. "I have a right to know what whore of the week my husband is seeing now." I grimaced and tried to back away, trying to leave the scene without being caught up in any further drama, and that's when I heard it. The click of a gun being
censored,
and I saw that it was pointed at Marcos, who was too close to me for comfort. I went to move away, and she swiveled the gun in my direction. "Are you his whore?" she said, and I finally noticed how crazy her eyes looked. They were red-rimmed and swollen from crying. It looked like she was a mix between being high, drunk, or in mourning, and from the sound of her voice and smell of her, I would say it was a mix of all those things. "I don't even know your husband. I'm just a private investigator." "Likely story," she hissed. "Put that gun down, Beth," Marcos hissed, clearly angry but not wanting to deal with a deranged woman with a gun. "No. You think I'm just going to let Tony keep running around on me? No. I'm done. It's over. Daddy said he wasn't good enough. I should have listened." Her voice became enraged, getting louder as she continued, clearly losing the little amount of control she still exercised over her emotions. "Your whole family is nothing but a bunch of sleazy." She didn't get to finish as Marcos sprung in her direction, and she spun instantly trying to avoid him, unwittingly pulling the trigger in the process, and I heard the sound of the bullet being discharged, knowing fully well that I would become the accidental target. I knew I was going to die, and as I prepped for the pain and agony in my
censored,
I felt a hand grab me and push me down. Only milliseconds passed. I stared up at the stranger in disbelief. On top of me was a man, the man in the dark jacket who had been watching the sunset. How he had gotten to my side so fast, I didn't know. I would have assumed that it was humanly impossible. Then I reasoned, he could have moved closer when I wasn't looking, since I had been too busy being sure I wouldn't be shot. I looked past the stranger on top of me, and I saw that the bullet had pierced the tree that was directly behind me. I sighed, whispered a prayer of gratitude to be alive, and looked up at him. "Thank you," I mumbled. "You just..." Too beguiled by his eyes, I couldn't continue speaking. They were an incredibly light gray, the irises barely perceptible in the light, and his body on top of mine felt warm as his
censored,
pressed against my
censored,
I was
censored,
tied suddenly, and he responded by smiling at me, deftly raising up and extending his hand to me. I was so mesmerized by the stranger that I didn't feel insulted at all, as he undressed me with his eyes. He started by taking in my legs. I was wearing tight leggings that left nothing to the imagination when it came to my modest curves, and then he slowly brought his eyes up to my small waist, barely there.
censored,
And then his eyes paused not at my face but my throat. He reached out and ran a finger down my throat. It was unexpected, and I felt a jolt that went from where he touched me and spread across my entire body. My skin felt increasingly warm. My
censored,
suddenly felt heavy, and I slowly reached up and let my hand hover over his as our eyes met. Instantly, I felt as if I knew this man. I opened my mouth to ask his name when I heard a noise, and I turned in its direction, broken from the trance I felt I was in. So focused on the stranger who saved my life, I didn't notice the brawl that was going on right next to me. Even the barking poodle had escaped my attention. Distractedly, I turned to say thank you to him again, but when I looked, he was no longer there. I looked around, ignoring Christopher holding the disgruntled Mrs. Palazzo down, while Marco seemed to be calling for reinforcements or for the authorities. I couldn't be sure which one. Mrs. Palazzo was now screaming and wiggling around, spewing obscenities and spitting. I shook my head and looked around again. Where had the man with the beautiful eyes disappeared to so quickly? "Lexa, a little help here," Christopher said pointedly, looking at the gun that was still near the now flailing woman's hand. I pushed it away with my foot. Marcos looked at Christopher and me with gratitude. "Thanks. The family owes you." I didn't know what to say exactly. Besides, does that mean you'll give me my camera and the pictures back? No. Well, I thought at least I'd try. I responded, and Marcos fought a smile. Authorities didn't arrive, but Tony did. I hadn't been expecting that, and he shook his head at the ridiculous figure his wife made seated between the stocky figures of Christopher and Marcos on the park bench, crying softly to herself. The gun had disappeared, and I assumed Marcos had it. Christopher immediately got up when he saw Tony approaching and signaled for us to leave. I didn't waste any time following behind Christopher to the parking lot. I turned to look behind me one last time, expecting to see Mrs. Palazzo clawing at her husband's face. Instead, I saw him squat in front of her, speak softly to her, and suddenly she was in his arms and he was holding her gently, stroking her hair as her entire body shook with sobs. She clung to him, and my heart went out to her. I couldn't see his face, but he held on to her tightly, possessively, even as he whispered into her ear. Marcos walked away awkwardly, giving them a private moment. Love is complicated, I thought to myself as I turned away, not sure who to feel sympathy for anymore. Chapter 3. Cooper, I'm sorry. Truly I am. I said repeatedly, as I attempted to parallel park my car with one hand and my phone pressed between my ear and my shoulder. Listen, can I call you back? I knew he had a right to be upset. I hadn't delivered on the pictures, but as I tried to reassure him, I sincerely doubted he would have to worry about his wife cheating on him again. Well, at least not with Tony Palazzo again. My simple request was met by more yelling, and I grimaced when he used one particular word. I knew he was upset, but he didn't have to be insulting. I was about to tell him when I heard a thump and looked up instantly in the rear-view mirror. A man stood there rubbing his hip, and I instantly hung up on Cooper and jumped out of my car. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't see you, I said, rounding the car. I didn't even look at his face, as I began dusting him off instead. Are you okay? God, I need to stop driving and talking at the same time. Yes, it seems you are better at taking care of one task at a time. His voice was melodic and deep. He had a slight accent, which made me wonder if he were from Russia, as I looked up at him about to reply. I stopped automatically when my eyes finally settled on his face. He smiled at me. It was the stranger from yesterday. It's you, I breathed. Yes. And apparently instead of thanking me, you're trying to kill me with your car. His lips tilted up at the end, and I knew he was joking with me. I smiled back, feeling myself lean in towards him as if drawn there by something I couldn't see. In the sunlight, I could clearly see his face. He had an olive complexion and a narrow nose. His eyes that I had dreams about the other night were just as luminous and beautiful as I remembered, lined with long, thick eyelashes. He had a beard that served to emphasize how masculine he looked. It was carefully sculpted and unbelievably sexy. When I finished taking in his face, I let my eyes roam across his body as he had done to me. At 5'10" I was tall for a woman, but he seemed to dwarf me, making me think he had to be about 6'4". He was lean muscled. I didn't see an ounce of body fat on the man. The way his jeans fit around his legs and crotch made my imagination come up with some interesting things. The t-shirt he was wearing highlighted his well-defined upper body, and as he crossed his arms over his
censored
and looked down at me with amusement, his biceps flexed and bulged against the sleeves. I stared, wanting to run my hands up his arms. Whom was I kidding? I didn't just want to run my hands up his arms. I wanted to devour this man. I was so fiercely attracted to him that if he asked me to go home with him, I wouldn't have said no. I would have left my car haphazardly parked and hopped in the car with him. That's how strong my
censored
was for him. For some reason, that scared me. I didn't even know this man's name. I figured I would start with his name, instead of tearing off his clothes. I'm Lexa. Lexa Charles. Lexa, he said my name softly, letting the syllables roll off his
censored
in such a way that I felt he caressed my name with his
censored
just by saying it. My name's Nico. It's truly a pleasure to meet you, officially. He extended his hand and I took it. Stupid mistake. As soon as my hand touched his, I felt it. That charge. That jolt. This man, with just a touch of his hand, had electrified all the nerve endings in my body. I didn't know how to deal with that. I was instantly conflicted, and then confused. I snatched my hand back, unable to think with him touching me. Nico. Well, thank you for the other night. You saved my life.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
Then slowly he pulled back, breathing my name and placing his hands on either side of my face. Now that was quite an introduction, he said with a boyish grin. I was about to smile as well, when I saw the other shopkeepers near my office staring out the windows at us. Immediately embarrassed, I mumbled, "I have to go," and I practically ran away from him. I didn't turn around to see if he were following me. I just disappeared into the little office building where my office was located on the first floor, then through the door, closing it sharply behind me, and leaning against it to take in a few breaths. Maybe I had overreacted, but I didn't make out with strangers in the middle of day in front of my office. In fact, I didn't make out with strangers at all, no matter the time of day. I had to think hard to even come up with the last time I had even been on a date. I changed the close sign to open while admonishing myself for my behavior. Nico was an attractive man, but I had been the one to start putting lips in places they shouldn't have been. I gave myself a second to calm down, but my skin still felt hot. I marched to the little bathroom in the hallway, nervously tucking a little pen behind my ear. I splashed water on my face and saw that my hands were shaking just a little. I didn't understand the new emotional roller coaster I was on, and it showed. Feeling as if I was finally back to normal, after a few minutes of deep breathing and continuously splashing cold water on my face, I walked to my office and sat at the front desk. I'm sure it was supposed to be a receptionist's desk, but I couldn't afford a receptionist. Normally, when clients came in, they asked to speak to the owner, and I tried to pretend that it wasn't awkward when I told them I was the owner and then led them to my real office in the back. I was busy trying to make changes to my website, hoping to drive more traffic to it and increase my business, when I heard the little bell dingle and I looked up. Nico walked into my office, and I immediately dropped my hands from the keyboard. "Are you following me or something?" I said instantly, and then felt I came across rude. That hadn't been my intention. I needn't have worried though, because he looked unfazed by my unfriendly greeting. "I stopped by earlier but you weren't here. I'm actually here to hire you. Strangely enough, I have a stalker problem." I wasn't expecting that, and assumed he was joking. I wasn't going to take the bait. "Is this a ploy to get me to go out with you?" It's funny that you can seriously ask me that question, given that you were practically glued to me less than 10 minutes ago. If I wanted to ask you out, I obviously wouldn't need a ploy if the way you
censored
me was any indication of your attraction for me. He said all of this with a small smile on his face. I blushed, knowing he was right. Our exchange was heated, and I had wanted to do a lot more than go out with him. That much had been very clear. I ignored his words, and instead decided to treat him like any other potential client. "Come back to my office. Let's talk." I led him to my recently organized office and took out a notepad and pen. "No iPad or tablet?" "I'm a little old-fashioned," I said with a shrug. "I like old-fashioned." I tried to ignore the way his smile made me melt a little and served to distract me completely. I shook my head as if to clear my thoughts and was about to speak again when he sat down and handed me a piece of paper with a name on it. "So this person is stalking you?" He nodded. "So you know exactly who's stalking you. Why do you need me? Why didn't you take this to the police?" Something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. I wanted additional information. Furthermore, why would a guy like you need a private investigator to stalk a stalker? I felt your body. You obviously could handle yourself in a fight. I couldn't help adding, you could just bash him a few good times and he would leave you alone. "I wish it were that easy," he sighed, sitting back in his chair across the desk from me. I couldn't help but stare at him again. Besides his eyes, his features were unremarkable individually, but together he was a very attractive man. I wanted to taste him again. I tried to get my mind back to the subject at hand and said, "Clearly something more is going on here. What do you need a private investigator for?" "I know who he is, but I can't get close to him. It's too dangerous for me. I need you to track him down for me. I need to know where he lives, what he does for a living. That type of thing." "Why?" "I think he means to kill me." Chapter 5. "What? What are you?" I said, backing away from him. "That's obvious," he said, not moving towards me. Soon, I was as far away from him as I could get in the confines of the elevator. "That can't be. Vampires," I gulped when I said it, "aren't real." "So, am I a figment of your imagination?" "Yes." He laughed harshly, which bared his teeth, and I sucked in a breath and looked around for a weapon. "Are you going to kill me?" I said, facing him when I found nothing. "Why would I do that?" "Because you're a vampire." "Shush. Calm down. I like this building. I don't want to get evicted." My mouth fell open. His main concern was being evicted, when there was a man bleeding everywhere on the elevator floor, still holding on to his privates. The man moaned a little, and Nico kicked him in his side. "What's going on?" "Apparently a war on my kind." "There are more of you?" He nodded, "Not many, but yes. Definitely more." "Why are they trying to kill you?" He looked sad for a second. "They've hunted my kind for a while, but for centuries we hadn't heard from them. Suddenly they were back. I guess they had been underground. They're more organized now. I needed your help to find out more about the one you saw following me. I couldn't get close to them or locate information about them as you could. That's why I hired you. I never thought this would happen, though. I'm sorry for putting you in danger." I didn't know what to say. His eyes started to turn back to normal, and I found that I was no longer as afraid. I knew deep down that Nico meant no harm. I reached a shaky hand out to touch his teeth. "Do you kill people?" I said softly, snatching my hand back. He shook his head solemnly. "I can survive fine on animals' blood." "And you can walk in the sunlight?" "Yes, contrary to what Hollywood says." The elevator began to lurch to one side, and he sighed. "It's time to go. I need you to trust me." He reached down and tossed the bleeding guy over his shoulder. "Like I said, I'm not a killer. Take my hand." I hesitated, and then I felt the elevator slowly move under my feet, and I grabbed Nico's hand. Just in time, it seemed, as the elevator disappeared from beneath my feet, moving fast, out of control towards the bottom floor, and I began to scream. I found myself tucked in Nico's side, as he effortlessly leapt through the ceiling of the elevator and grabbed hold to the cables in the elevator shaft. I looked around, clinging to him, afraid he would drop me. Now what? Hold on, he said, and he arranged me so that I was clinging to his neck on his back. Please don't drop me, I whispered as the elevator final gave and the cable snapped, sending us hurtling to the ground. I screamed for what seemed to be forever and closed my eyes. Shish, I heard Nico say, and I opened my eyes only to find us in the crushed elevator, perfectly unscathed. Even the bleeding guy on Nico's shoulder slept through the entire ordeal. I could hear voices and noise from a distance, and then before I knew it, Nico was pulling back the elevator doors. We were stuck between floors and had to climb out to get to the next floor, but I was just grateful to be alive. As Nico and I stumbled out, paramedics descended on us. Nico pushed them away and said, "There's one other guy in there. I think he needs help. He looks like he's unconscious." As everyone went to peer in, Nico took me by my hand and winked. Then he picked me up, and before I could protest, he began to run. At least, I thought he was running. All I felt was the gush of wind on my face and the feeling of weightlessness, and then finally, when everything became clear again, I was no longer in the lobby of his building. We were at my home. I turned around, thinking I must indeed be dreaming, and then I saw Nico easily opening the door besides it being locked, and he walked into my home as if he owned it. Of course, a lock wouldn't keep a vampire out. I followed behind him, still in a state of shock for all I had learned that night. I sat down heavily on my couch, and he sat on the love seat across from me. Giving me room, he was still being thoughtful besides the craziness of our day. I didn't want to think about that. I willed my mind to think of anything else. We sat there in silence, until I abruptly said, "So is everything the same? I mean, are you an actual human? Do you all make love the same?" He looked at me in surprise and then smiled. "Come here and find out." I didn't need another invitation as I approached him and crawled on top of him. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid of him. I was curious. More than anything else, I was aroused.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
Thank you for reading my book. If you like this story, I think you'll enjoy my book, Your Eyes Only. Get your copy of Sold to the Werewolf now. Please leave a review if you like this book. That's the best thing you can do to help authors like me, so others can find my books. It can be as long or as short as you'd like. Even a star rating is amazing and appreciated. Thanks in advance. Read more sexy and romantic books by USA Today best-selling author, Summer Cooper. Dark Desires. A Billionaire Dark Romance Series. Dark Desire. Dark Rules. Dark Secret. Dark Time. Dark Truth. Bar to Bar. A Billionaire Second Chance Series. Dancing with Lies. Dancing with Temptation. Dancing with Doubt. Dancing with Guilt. Dancing with Redemption. Twisted Intention. A Billionaire Revenge Romance Series. Twisted Beauty. Twisted Love. Twisted Fate. Mafia's Obsession. A Hot Mafia Romance Series. Mafia's Dirty Secret. Mafia's Fake Bride. Mafia's Final Play. Screaming Demons. An MC romance series full of suspense. Rough start, rough ride, rough choice, rough patch, rough return, rough road, rough trip, rough night, rough love. Check out Summer's entire collection at www.summercooper.com/books. About Summer Cooper. Thank you so much for reading. Without you, it wouldn't be possible for me to be a full-time author. I hope you enjoy reading my books as much as I do writing them. Besides, obviously, reading and writing, I also love cuddling my dogs, shouting at Alexa, being upside down, aka yoga, and driving my family cray-cray. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Goodreads, BookBub. Get in touch at hello@summercooper.com. www.summercooper.com. Closing credits. This has been saved by the vampire. Written by Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited. Production copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited.